Hey everyone, we're going to look at number 2 in section 1.3 of Acheive. Your problem should look similar to this. It's determining the domain of a function like this. And when we talk about domain, just a real quick note, you will want to be familiar with the domains and ranges for all the basic functions that we learn about in pre-calculus. That includes the polynomial functions like these, absolute value function, root functions, reciprocal functions, exponential and log functions, and all the trig functions, inverse trig functions. So this sheet, by the way, is found in Brightspace. It's on the in the content area in the resources module. So you'll see it there along with an algebra and trigonometry help sheet that I allow you to use on tests. So you would want to look at in content area under resources. You can print this out if you need to, but you should be familiar with these functions and their domains and ranges. Okay. When we're, of course, looking at particular functions, then we want to be familiar with these. But the two most important things when we're looking at a domain of a function is we cannot divide by 0 and get a real number. And so any value that would make us divide by 0 should be excluded from the domain of the function. Again, we're talking about the domain of a function where we're not explicitly told any restrictions on the values of x. So we're simply finding the values of x that result in a real number output, and division by 0 would not work. That means our denominator here, x squared minus 64, cannot be 0, which means x squared cannot be 64, which means x cannot be plus or minus 8. Don't forget the negative root there when we're talking about squaring x, right? Negative 8 quantity squared is indeed 64. So we would want to exclude certainly 8 and negative 8 from the domain. The other problem then that we run into is when we take the square root of a negative number, that's not a real number, right? It's a imaginary number. And so we're looking for real outputs. In this case, I'm taking the square root of x. And so we know that x, the stuff under the radical here, what we call the radicand, x, cannot be negative, which means it must be greater than or equal to 0. Yes, it can be 0 because the square root of 0 is indeed 0. So putting these two things together tells me the domain has to be only non-negative values greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so negative 8, don't have to worry about that anymore because it's excluded here. But I do have to exclude 8. So the way I would write that in interval notation, greater than or equal to 0, I start with a bracket on 0, meaning I include 0. So it is important that you make that bracket very clear. Up to 8, parentheses, meaning I exclude 8. And then I will go from parentheses 8 to infinity, right? This is everything including 0 up to not including 8, and then everything greater than 8. The infinity symbol meaning there's no right endpoint in the interval. We continue forever. And then this is the little symbol for union. When we have 2 or more intervals, we use the union symbol, meaning the domain can be any number in this interval or this interval. Essentially, the union symbol simply means or. Okay, so that's the solution. I just want to look at a little variation of this problem. This was pretty simple, I think, in the fact that you're just taking the square root of x. What if instead you had the square root of x, you had the square root of the quantity 3 minus 8x? Same denominator here. What would the difference be here? What's the domain of this function? We still want the denominator to not be 0, which means x cannot be plus or minus 8. But now the stuff under the radical is not just x, but it's 3 minus 8x. We want that to be greater than or equal to 0. And we need to solve this linear inequality. How do we do that? Just like we solve a linear equation, essentially, we isolate the x term. I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So I get negative 8x is greater than or equal to negative 3. And then to solve for x, I want to divide by negative 8. But do you remember what happens when I multiply or divide by a negative number on an inequality? That's right. The inequality direction changes. The sign flips, if you want to say it that way, but we have to change the direction. And dividing -3 by -8, negative divided by negative makes that +3/8. And so x must be less than or equal to 3/8. So what's the domain of this function? Well, we're less than or equal to 3/8. So I don't have to worry about the +8, but I do have to exclude the -8. So that means I'm going to go from -infinity to -8. This is everything less than -8. Notice the parentheses, not including -8. And then parentheses, not including -8, up to what? +3/8. And we can include 3/8, right? Because again, we can be less than or equal to 3/8. We just need to exclude -8. So basically, everything less than or equal to 3/8 except -8. Okay, I hope that this clarifies things on finding the domain. If you need more help, please let me know.